Yeah. So I'll give William a bit of an introduction and then request him to talk about how he came to write this remarkable book. 'Cause the reason I call the book remarkable is it's not just about making a ton of money; it's also about how to live a satisfying, fulfilling life. So the book was published around 15 months ago, spring 2021. And the reason I remember that is within weeks of publication, two local investors sent copies over to me, and I was very intrigued that the same copy of the book, two copies of the book from local investors. I thought it must be something remarkable. It took me, I think, a week to finish the book, and I was very glad I read it promptly, as did many other people across the world, because it's a book about quirky investors, interesting, successful investors, and their very quirky habits. We'll get into some of that in a bit, but let me introduce the man. Let me introduce William Green. He's had a very classical education, Eton College, followed by English literature in Oxford University, and then followed by a master's degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. So I think that's Ivy League and Oxbridge all along the way, and I don't think you can study journalism in a better place than Columbia. Then after that, he worked in very prominent publications, the New Yorker, Time, Fortune, Forbes. All of these are very high-profile publications. Bloomberg Markets. He worked for them in newspapers and magazines. From what I found on Brilliant's background, he's lived in London. He's lived in the Middle East. He's lived in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, he was editing the Asian edition of Time. And then after all of that, at some stage, and William will tell us when, he gave it all up to become a writer. He's written, ghostwritten, co-written, and edited several prominent books, including #1 New York Times bestsellers. There's a book that he wrote that I love and I read 7 or 8 years ago, which is Guy Spears' biography, The Education of a Value Investor, which William helped Guy Spear write. And then he's also written a book called Great Minds of Investing. So William, that's a formidable sort of background. After all that, how did you hit upon this great idea of writing a book, not just on investors and their investment techniques, but also their holistic view on life?
Thanks so much, Saurabh. Well, my resume sounds much more impressive than the reality. I think if people actually saw how much of my time I'm unproductive and confused and sit around kind of twiddling my thumbs and reading and trying to think about what I'm supposed to do, they'd be kind of shocked. But I mean, one thing that people will notice, I think, from that resume is it was a very literary background. I studied English literature at Oxford. I didn't study economics or accounting or business. And I'm slightly embarrassed by this because when I was writing this book, I kept thinking, God, will people realize that I actually, I have no grounding in this stuff? What happened is that I just was obsessed with the stock market. And so from a very early age, I saw my father reading the Financial Times. My father was a barrister and then a judge in London. And he would sit there on the sofa with a glass of scotch in a beautiful cut glass, crystal glass, reading the Financial Times. And when we would go on vacation, the very first thing he would do, he would say, son, I'm going to go look for the Financial Times, because he wanted to read about his stocks and see what was happening. So I think from a very early age, I had this sense that there was a magic in the stock market, that, I wondered, why does this thing my father so much? What is there in this? And then when I was in my, I guess, mid-20s, I sold an apartment that my brother and I owned in London. And so I had, this is much before property in London became vastly expensive. And so I had a slight windfall and I needed to figure out what to do with the money. And so I started to study the stock market and mutual funds and the like really seriously. And I think it built on that sense of wonder from early in my life of seeing my father, because suddenly I thought, wait, there's this whole area where if you're smart and you think about it and you're diligent, you can make money without actually working that hard. Like, I don't need to mow lawns. I don't need to paint houses. I can sit there at my desk or on my sofa reading stuff and then put money on this stock or put money in this fund, and it's going to compound. And I think because I was slightly lazy by nature and also slightly rebellious and subversive, like I don't like following rules, I just thought this is the coolest thing ever. And so I started then in my mid-20s, I guess, to interview great investors, because I was writing for magazines like Forbes and Money, and later for Time and Barron's and the like. And so what was amazing was that I actually, unlike most people, had this opportunity to go off and interview, say, Peter Lynch, who was this legend from Fidelity, or Jack Bogle, who founded Vanguard, which I think now manages over $7 trillion. Or I would go to the Bahamas and interview Sir John Templeton for a day. And so I just had this incredible, rare opportunity to interview the greatest investors in the world. And so gradually, over the last, let's say, 25, 30 years, almost 30 years, I've just interviewed so many of these people. And at a certain point, I realized, wait a second, there's something very special here. This isn't just about making money. These people are such extraordinary thinkers. They have a different way of approaching life, a different way of cracking problems, a different way of tilting the odds in their favor in every area of life, not just in investing, but thinking more rationally in other areas of life. And so I started to think of, maybe about 7, 8 years ago, I started to think, what if I could go back and interview all of the most interesting people that I've interviewed over the last decade, 2 decades, go back to the greatest interviews that I did way back when, pick the highlights from things like my interview with Sir John Templeton, who's now passed away, or Jack Bogle, who's now passed away, and then go interview all of these new extraordinary people. So I think more than 40 people I interviewed for this book. So what if I could really figure out what there is to learn from these people, not just about investing, but about how to think better and even how to live more wisely? So this book became this crazy, mad, ambitious scheme where I thought, I'm just going to try to synthesize everything we can learn from these extraordinary people. And so then not surprisingly, it took me about 5 years, and I missed my deadline by 2 years, much to the horror of my publisher, because it's a huge task. But this is what the book really is trying to do, is synthesize the most important lessons I've learned from these extraordinary people over the last 25 years or so.
Unbelievable. So glad you did that. I think we all benefit from your 5 years of intense labor. So folks,
and pain, Saurabh, lots of pain.
Right. So your pain, our gain, so to speak. So I'm being a little selfish here, but folks, read Richer, Wiser, Happier. It's truly well written. Every line, every sentence is rewarding. And put your questions in that Q&A box. We've got William for another 40 minutes or 50 minutes or so. So please put the questions in the Q&A box. My colleague Salil will take the questions from there and pose them to William, as many of the questions as we can in the next 50 minutes or so. So William, let's get into the book side. One of the things that I realized within the first couple of chapters is this whole construct of cloning, that rather than us reinventing the wheel, we can clone a great investor like a John Templeton or a Charlie Munger, right? To what extent is that really possible? You spend so much time with these legends. To what extent can ordinary people like us, how can we clone a legend like Charlie Munger?
Yeah, to some degree, you can't clone Charlie because he's just so much smarter than I am, for example. And so there's a part of me that looks at someone like Charlie or looks at Sir John Templeton, and I just think, well, so Sir John Templeton came top of his class at Yale, number one in his class at Yale, while I think working full time, and then got a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford. So these are really smart people. So I don't have their brain power, but there's a really important thing going on here, which is their ideas, their principles, their ways of operating are clonable. And that's a really important realization. So think, for example, of one of the most important operating principles that Charlie Munger has, which is, he explained to me when I went to interview him in California for the book, that it's not actually that he's so clever that's such an advantage. What he's actually doing systematically is collecting examples of what he calls standard stupidities, or inanities and asininities, the dumb things that people do. And then he's saying, I'm going to systematically reduce or avoid the number of really dumb and predictable mistakes that people make. So this is a very clonable idea. So I may not be as smart as Munger, but I can say, okay, let me think about all of the dumb things that investors do, and then not do that. So what Charlie does, he says always invert, which is an idea that he got from this 19th century mathematician. So you start by saying, okay, what would a terrible investor do? And then you invert that and you say, well, so then I can figure out what a good investor would do. So if we think about all of the ways that people have come undone recently, all of the terrible mistakes they made, typical things people did, right? They chased after assets they didn't understand, right? So they would buy really hot tech stocks that they really didn't understand. They would chase fads. They would buy the most popular, priciest assets. They would chase after things like cryptocurrencies because they were, afraid of missing out. They had return envy. They invested borrowed money that they couldn't afford to lose. They trade too often. They have high expenses, right? High trading expenses, high taxes, high fees. They live beyond their means, so they can't handle downturns. So then they're forced to sell at the worst possible moment. They buy cyclical companies at the top of the cycle. Or they obsess about market predictions, macro predictions about inflation or growth rates or recessions, which really, I think, if we're honest, most of us kind of know in our heart, none of us can predict. So think about all of the dumb things that we do and then say, well, let me reduce that. And what's beautiful, Saurabh, is that you can apply this same approach of reducing standard stupidities to life. So one of the things that Charlie Munger very memorably said is three things ruin people. If I remember rightly, he said they're drugs, liquor, and leverage. And so what the smartest investors are doing is they're systematically avoiding things where there's catastrophic downside, right? Where there's a risk of ruin. So one of the things that I cloned that sounds really obvious is if, for example, I've gone out for a dinner in New York City with a friend and we've drunk wine, I come back to my home here in Westchester, which is about an hour. It's maybe a 45-minute train ride out. And my car is sitting there waiting. And I've had this happen several times. And I get there and I'm like, well, have I drunk too much? And I'm like, well, my home's only like 5 minutes away from the train station. I'm probably okay. And then I'm like, yeah, but what if I'm wrong? I know that we're overconfident. I know we delude ourselves. What if I mess up? What's the downside? What if I hit someone, God forbid? Or what if I, what if I lost my driver's license? What would I do? And so so I would call my son, my poor 24-year-old son, or my 21-year-old daughter, and I would say, please come pick me up. Or I'd wake my wife up, these awkward things. But just that habit of saying, I'm going to try to avoid catastrophe.
Right.
If you apply that throughout your life, in both in life and investing, so think of the amount of pain we would have spared ourselves in the last few months just by not betting too much on things we didn't understand, or not getting too carried away by the euphoria, or not getting too carried away by jealousy of our brother-in-law who is making money by doing incredibly stupid things, putting 150% of his net worth in Bitcoin and Solana and stuff. And you'd look at it and you'd be like, God, what am I missing? I better chase in. And it's like, no, I don't need to do that in order to become financially secure and independent. So I think that's a good example of something where you don't have to be as smart as Charlie Munger or Sir John Templeton to clone an idea that's incredibly powerful, both in investing and life.
Right. So just staying with that subject, right, of cloning other legends. So in the opening chapter of the book, you describe how Mohnish Pabrai has very successfully cloned Buffett and Munger, right? And I think it was the riveting chapter how you describe your travels with Mohnish Pabrai, who's quite a singular man. So Pabrai belongs to the cloning school. He says, I do what these other legends do, Buffett and Munger. And then you describe the John Templeton chapter is very different, very individualistic, utterly singular man from his fitness habits that you describe to his investing style, to his choice of residence, right? Singular in every way. There are plenty of young investors who are watching this webinar. They'll be caught between these two polarities, right? Should I do my own thing? Should I be non-conformist like William Green and do my own thing? Or should I follow the well-trodden path, the classical path to greatness as described by, say, Buffett and Munger? How is a young aspirant, William, basis your study of these great investors, how does a young aspirant know? Should he be copying or should she be original?
It's a very nuanced and complex and interesting question. I think one of the things that you need to start with is some degree of self-awareness, which is really important both in investing and in life. So you have to say to yourself, can I actually invest in a way that's similar, say, to a Buffett, a Munger, a Sir John Templeton? I mean, do I have the temperamental advantage that they have? For example, I look at the greatest investors, and there are certain characteristics that they all have in common. So they tend to be extraordinarily rational, very independent-minded, very unemotional, incredibly diligent and driven and competitive, very patient. So one of the things that you have to start with is to say, well, am I equipped temperamentally to clone these people? And so I look at myself, for example, and I'm like, well, actually, I'm a slightly fearful person. I'm slightly anxious. I'm kind of impatient. I'm not, much as I love the stock market, which I really do, I don't really want to sit around reading annual reports the whole time. Like, I mean, if you look on my screen, I mean, you know, if you look at my bookshelf, it goes up much higher than that. And then I have more books overwhelming the shelf here. I have more books on the floor here. So I'm sort of built for a game of reading, thinking, trying to synthesize ideas, interviewing people, and sharing those ideas with other people. I'm not really built for betting very unemotionally and dispassionately on the stock market. So that's the first thing I think you need to know is what game are you actually deeply interested in and truly equipped temperamentally and intellectually to win. And one of the great lessons from people like Ed Thorpe, who I write about in the introduction, who's not only one of the greatest investors of all time, but one of the greatest gamblers of all time. He's the guy who figured out how to count cards and beat the casino at blackjack and then roulette. And one of the things Ed Thorpe does is he says, well, I don't play games I can't win. Unless I have an edge, I don't play. And when I said to him, you know, how can I tell if I have an edge in the stock market? He said, well, if you're asking that question, if you don't really know whether you have an edge and you can't articulate it, chances are you don't. And so that's a really important first question. Ask yourself if you're equipped to win this particular game. But then I would say you need to clone, because you need to start asking yourself, what are the rules of the game that these incredibly smart people who are way smarter than me, way older, way more knowledgeable, have figured out already? And it would be really dumb not to study the Templetons and the Buffetts and the Mungers and figure out what they already worked out. So what Mohnish did, which is really fascinating, is he started studying Buffett, and he said, well, wait a second, this guy basically laid out the laws of investing, and they're as fundamental as the laws of physics. And they were all built on stuff that Ben Graham had taught Buffett. And so you think about these three fundamental rules, which if I can remember them now early in the morning before my coffee has really kicked in. The first one is when you're buying a stock, you're not just buying a piece of paper that you're going to trade and speculate on. What you're purchasing is actually a portion of an ongoing business that has an underlying value, right? So that's a fundamental principle. Principle number two, the market's a voting machine. It's not a weighing machine. And so what Ben Graham said is, the market's like this manic depressive, right? Mr. Market goes crazy. Sometimes he's really bullish and excited. Sometimes he's really pessimistic and gloomy. And so stock prices don't necessarily reflect the true value of the business. And the third principle is that you just want to buy when the stock is selling for much less than it's really worth. So really what Mohnish figures out is, well, so the whole game is one of extreme patience, where really what I'm doing is sitting by the side of the stream like a spear fisherman, as Charlie would say, waiting for this fat, juicy salmon to swim by. And then I'm going to spear the salmon, and then I'm going to go back to sitting on my hands for 6 months. So you're just waiting for these rare moments. So that's an incredibly beautiful and powerful principle that you need to understand. You need to clone that. You need to understand this is how the business works. And so someone like Joe Greenblatt, who's one of the most successful hedge fund managers of all time, said to me, look, it all comes down to this. There's really one basic principle, which is figure out what something is worth and then pay a lot less, right? So it's this process of extreme selectivity. You're not trying to trade a lot. You're not trying to jump in and out of the market. You're not trying to predict things the whole time, where inflation is going, how fast the economy is going. You're just waiting for a few mispriced bets. So I think if you're a young aspirant trying to get into this business, A, know yourself. Ask yourself, what am I equipped to win this game temperamentally and intellectually? And B, let me study the rules of the game. Because this sounds so obvious, but what Mohnish said to me in his very colorful language, which I won't quote exactly, he's like, look, I'm playing against all these morons who don't even know the rules of the game. And that's a huge advantage. You know, if you really try to understand the principles of this game, you have a huge advantage. So you want to be going back and studying Buffett, studying Munger, studying Howard Marks, studying Joel Greenblatt, studying these people who figured out the rules of the game. But then you also want to invest in a way that suits your temperament, because for someone like Charlie Munger, Charlie will say, well, look, I could have a well-diversified stock portfolio that consisted of 4 stocks. That would give me a heart attack. There's no way I could concentrate my portfolio that much. So you clone, you learn the principles, but then you adapt them to your own temperament. You have to, if you decide that you're just going to concentrate on 4 stocks, 6 stocks, it can be suicidal. I own a hedge fund run by a friend of mine, very, very smart guy, who owns about 12 stocks. He's down 40% this year. And I emailed him recently and I was like, you're doing okay? How do you feel? And he's like, yeah, luckily I just don't really feel it. I just, that's not, so he's able to invest in a very long-term patient way. So he can clone Charlie. And I can do it by investing with him, but boy, I couldn't do it myself because I don't understand the companies well enough. Whereas he understands his companies. He's like, I'm happy owning this for 5-10 years.
Right. Very interesting. So let's move away now from the money side of it to the life side of it, right? Because one of the most interesting facets of your book, and I think this is what makes your book utterly singular, is the descriptions you've given of how these investors manage their lives beyond their money, how they manage their lives. And the picture that we get is that these people don't just manage money methodically, they seem to be managing their own lives in a structured manner, in a systematic manner. And whilst these guys are doing this systematic, structured living, the rest of us, by and large, myself included, are sort of making it up as we go along. So, basis what you've read, basis your reading of these people, how can the rest of us become a little bit more methodical, a little bit more systematic, a little bit more disciplined about how we think and how we live?
Yeah, I wrote a chapter called High Performance Habits, where I was trying to figure out, okay, so how do these people operate not only in markets, but in life? What gives them a competitive advantage over time by really adopting the right habits whose benefits compound over time? And in some ways, the poster boy for this is Tom Gaynor. And what fascinated me with Tom, who's really the star of that chapter, is that he's not trying to be optimal. There are a lot of great investors who almost are like professional athletes. They'll adopt habits where they're life hacking and they're figuring out their exact diet. And I remember a guy called Jason Carr, fascinating hedge fund manager, who's since left the business to be in venture capital and private equity. But he had a meditation room in his office, and he wouldn't allow junk food in his office, and everything was it really was like approaching things as an extreme athlete. But what Tom Gaynor said to me, which I loved, is he said, I just want to be directionally correct. So I don't need to be optimal. I just need to find some habits that are decent over time. So for example, he said to me, I needed to lose weight because my weight drifted over 200 pounds. So I told the world I was just going to lose 1 pound a year for 10 years. And that sounds incredibly unambitious, but what it actually shows is that these small incremental advantages add up over time. So I think what you want to do is identify a handful of habits that are really likely to get you to a good destination in 10, 15, 20 years, whatever it is, 3 years, 6 months, whatever your time horizon, and then just plug away. And so one person I interviewed, Ken Schubenstein, who was a very successful investor who's actually become a neurologist and so is an expert on the brain, said to me, for example, there are 4 things that we know improve our brain health and improve our brain function, which obviously is very important for any investor, but also important in life. So he said they're exercise, meditation, good sleep, good nutrition. So think about just those 4 things. So you start to say, okay, so if I want to get old age, being able to think well, if I want to have an intellectual advantage, an intellectual edge, I have to actually take these things seriously. So, you know, I at the start of the pandemic, I bought a Peloton because I'm like, look, I don't have control over the variants, all the mutations, but I'm probably 20, 30 pounds too heavy. I'm really sedentary. I sit with my feet on my desk the whole time reading, except for when I walk to the fridge. I was joking to my kids that basically it's 20 feet to the fridge and about 22 feet to the coffee machine. So I'm like, so if I go 15 times a day to the coffee machine, you know, I get my whatever number of steps. But just knowing the rules of the game, knowing that the good habits compound over time. So you want to figure out a handful of these key habits and then just plug away in a way that's directionally correct. And you can find habits from the great investors that are really surprising. So think of someone like Guy Spear, whose book The Education of a Value Investor you mentioned before. One of the things Guy is obsessed with is compounding goodwill. And so Guy would write 3 thank you letters a day for years, and everyone thought he was nuts. And he would send people books the whole time as gifts. He would send chocolate. So he's just constantly doing things that are kind. He's always trying to find ways to help. After several years of doing this, I can't tell you the impact. I mean, there are so many people around the world who want to help Guy, who owe Guy in different ways because it's just been really decent and kind. And so this idea of compounding goodwill over time also turns out to be incredibly powerful. So I would just encourage people as they read the book, pick out a few things that resonate with you. I mean, some people are not going to want to meditate. Some people are not going to want to exercise obsessively. Fine. But at least be aware of the habits that are going to compound over time and give you this small incremental advantage that in 10, 20 years, you look back on and you're like, oh my God, what an overwhelming advantage. And I interviewed on my podcast, it's an episode coming out this Saturday, Daniel Goleman, who was the guy who wrote the book on emotional intelligence, which has sold more than 5 million copies. And Dan started to meditate very seriously around 1969, 1970. He came to India and spent time with Neem Karoli Baba. And I look at Dan and I'm like, 50 years of meditation. Look how present this guy is. Look how calm he is. Look how much equanimity he has. And I'm like, God, that's something I want more of. So when you see someone who's way further along the path than you, reverse engineer it and say, what habits got them there, and then adopt that.
So slightly different notes. One of the when I was first reading about Warren Buffett, this was when I was still in university and I didn't know much about investing. One of the most endearing things about the man was that he liked cheeseburgers and Diet Coke. And I said, no, Cherry Coke and cheeseburger. I thought this is a habit I can emulate. And I'm still trying to get beyond that. Unfortunately for me, the cheeseburgers show up a little bit quicker than they show up for Warren Buffett.
You know, there's a crazy thing though, Saurabh. If you read Poor Charlie's Almanac, there's somewhere, if I remember rightly, where Charlie wrote, I think, to President Nixon, with diet advice many years ago. It's like, what's going on there? You know, that's a story we never hear. Really? Charlie had lost weight. He'd gone on some diet and he got really obsessed with it. And he writes to President Nixon to say, yeah, I think you should try this diet. So, I would clone someone else's diet rather than Warren's, probably. But he obviously has an amazing constitution. And, you know, Tom Gaynor was on the board of the Washington Post with Warren. And he said Warren has unbelievable energy. He said he's like the Energizer Bunny, and he gets up at the start of the day and he just works, and he never stops. And Tom said to me, that's an athletic feat.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. So there is something weird in Warren's makeup. Maybe it's because he's doing what he loves. So, and he's surrounded by people that he loves and admires, and he loves the process of investing and reading and thinking. And so maybe it doesn't feel like work, but I do think there's enormous energy.
Tom Gaynor's fitness regime that you've described in the book, I think that's also very interesting. I think it's worth explaining to people that Tom Gaynor, lost weight, I think considerable amount of weight, basis what you've written in the book, following a pretty simple workout regime, right? Steady. I think there's walking around the block X number of times every day for Y number of years, and he got there. So compounding of weight loss in a way.
Yeah, I think he said, well, he read some article on an airplane, and it said, do you hate running? And he's like, yep, I hate running. And it said, but what if you could build this habit? And it said, I think it started, he had to run 5 minutes a day for the first week. And he said, yeah, I can do that. And then it was 10 minutes a day or 7 minutes a day or something, and then 10, and then 12, then 50, so before you knew it, you'd built up a new habit over a month or so, and you could run. But even there, actually, what I don't mention in the book is at a certain point, he hurt himself running. I think it's plantar fasciitis or something, and he couldn't run a couple of years ago. And so even there, when you're picking a habit whose benefits are going to compound, I would say the Peloton, not to be an advertiser for the Peloton, but it's low impact. And so you're less likely to get injured by adopting that over time than running. So I just think you want to be very consciously picking habits that compound. And then when you fail and you fall off track, there's a wonderful line from this meditation teacher, Sharon Salzberg, who also studied in India, who says, let go with self-compassion and begin again. And so one of the things that I noticed, I adopted this from Tom Gaynor. He said you should weigh yourself every day, because then you don't drop that far off center. And so it's easier to recover. And the last few days, I'm like, I really don't want to weigh myself, because I don't want to depress myself, because I know I've put on a bit of weight. And so there's this contest between denial and having the knowledge that will help you. And so it's not like you win these battles and you're done. For me, it's always going to be, I think, a struggle to control my weight. And whereas it's not a struggle for me to control my drink, but at least, I don't smoke, I don't do drugs, so we each have our vices. But I think to know that when you fail and you fall off the wagon, whatever wagon it is, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be optimal. And Tom's view is that being more balanced is actually more sustainable. And so people who are extreme, I think, often fail in the long run, because it's hard to sustain that. So if you have this attitude of, okay, so I didn't meditate yesterday, and I didn't eat well, and I didn't exercise, but that's okay. Let go with self-compassion and begin again. Today I'll meditate.
Absolutely love that. So folks, keep firing in those questions in the Q&A box. I'll hand over to my colleague Salil Desai, who will try to take as many of your questions as possible in the next half an hour or so. Over to you, Salil.
Thanks, Saurabh. Yeah, so a lot of questions coming in. William, the first one, it's an interesting one from Amit Kavoor, and he asks, it's does getting richer and becoming wiser make one happier, in the sense that how do you link being wealthy, gaining experience, knowledge, wisdom, and then eventually becoming happier for that?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question, and this is something I explore at length in the epilogue, because I didn't want to say to people, look, you should read this whole book and try to become rich, and then be like, well, great, I did that, and what's my life worth? And so I was really exploring this question of what actually makes for a truly abundant and successful life. And one thing, I didn't want to be naive and sort of say, well, money doesn't matter. Money does matter. I went through a period during the financial crisis where I was editing the European, Middle East, and African edition of Time. and I lost my job at a point where the global economy seemed to be falling apart. This late 2008, my stock portfolio was down massively. And I had 2 kids in private school in England, an expensive rent, and it was scary. I don't want to be in that position again. I mean, I want to be financially secure, financially independent. I don't want to have to take orders from people I don't like. I want to work on projects that I like with people I like. And so money is important for that. And one of the things that I found in interviewing a lot of the greatest investors is they would all talk about independence. Someone like Mohnish doesn't, I mean, he did have a Ferrari at one point, which he told me a couple of weeks ago. He told me he'd sold recently since he moved to Texas. But Mohnish, what he values, and he learned this also from Charlie, is his independence. He doesn't want to have to do things like market his fund or talk to his shareholders the whole time, or prospective shareholders, and pitch himself. He said, I'm not interested in the whole mumbo jumbo of marketing the fund. And so he's perfectly happy to give up millions of dollars a year in fees to live in a way that's true to who he is. So that, for me, that's a very important idea, right? I want to have money. I want to be financially independent. I want not to have to worry about paying the next bill. But really what I'm looking for is that kind of independence, to live in a way that's true to who I am. And I think that's what the money gives these people. It's the ability to live in a way that's true to themselves. The other thing in writing that chapter that I really tried to focus on is that if you're incredibly rich, but you don't have equanimity, you don't have peace of mind, you kind of have nothing. And so a lot of that epilogue is about this idea that you really need to pay attention to your inner life, your state of mind. I think that's a really important idea. And so when I look at a lot of the greatest investors, they're really thinking about how am I going to be peaceful? How am I going to remain calm? What impact will it have on me if I have good relationships? One of the things that Guy Spear said to me is, he said, if I'm not getting on with my wife or my kids, my life's kind of a disaster. So I really need to focus on having good relationships. And I think for some investors, they're so obsessed with their returns and their assets under management and stuff that they lose sight of that. And there was a wonderful moment where Mohnish went to Charlie Munger's house, and he sent me a video where he asked Charlie about the book, and Charlie was like, yeah, I love the book. It's a fantastic book. And he said, and you know, what insights did you find interesting? And Charlie said something to the effect of, yeah, I thought it was really interesting how many of us ended up divorced. And he said it kind of makes sense, because we were so consumed with what we did, you know, it's so all consuming. And so I think you have to think really seriously about your relationships. One of the great lessons from people like Ed Thorpe, when I said to him, how do you win the game of life? He said, well, who you spend your time with is probably the most important thing of all. So if you win the game of making money, but you don't pay attention to your relationships and you don't pay attention to building equanimity, I think you're on very fragile ground. And so you want to be able to look back at the end of your life and say, okay, I didn't neglect my family. I didn't neglect my friendships. I lived in a way that was true to who I am. And that's so you have to optimize for some of those things and not just making money. But this is a luxury, right? Because when you're in a position where you're really frightened about your money and whether you can support your kids and stuff, there are times where you just have to say, no, I have to work unbelievably hard now. And but just knowing the fact that the measure of a successful life is not how much money you have. It's got to include equanimity. It's got to include good relationships. It also has to include some element of sharing. I think it's very striking to me that the happiest investors I've met all have found ways to give back. And you look at Mohnish with Dakshana, his foundation that's thousands of very, very gifted youngsters out of poverty, giving them an opportunity to shine by helping them get into the IITs, by giving them free coaching. That's an extraordinary thing. And I remember Mohnish has this lovely daughter, Monsoon, who I traveled with Mohnish and Monsoon in India for several days. And I remember Monsoon saying to me once, she said, I have a tattoo of the Dakshana logo. I think it was on her arm. She said, I don't have a tattoo of the Pabrai Fund's logo. And that was what she was really proud of. And Monsoon has become a hedge fund manager as well. So I thought that was really revealing. And for Mohnish, one of the highlights of his life is to travel to meet the kids, to meet the families. And they talked about going to meet this amazing guy, Ashok Talapatra, who I wrote about very briefly in the book, who, I mean, he came from this very poor family that I remember Monsoon telling me they had a pink plastic shower curtain as their front door, and the roof just let in so much rain. And Mohnish sees how brilliant Ashok is, and he sponsors him. He gets into Dakshana, and I think he came 63rd in the country in the entrance exams to IIT. So what's that, out of something like 1 million entrants, came 63rd. He's an absolutely brilliant guy, and then gets a job at Google. And one of the first things he does is buys a home for his parents that actually has a roof that the rain doesn't come through. And I think when Mohnish looks back on his life, the thing that he's really proud of is lifting people like Ashok, who are incredibly talented out of poverty. And I met Ashok a few times, both in India and then at Google, when I went to give a Google talk. And I remember saying to him, where did you get your intelligence? Or either for your parents extraordinary? And he said, yeah, boy, is my father a good mathematician. And I said, and what did he do? He said, he's a tailor, and he made about $100 a month as a tailor. You think of the brilliance of that guy that hasn't been able to shine. And what's interesting to me is my late grandfather, Henry, who my son is named after, left school at the age of, I think, 13, because this in London, because he was from a very poor Jewish immigrant family. And the sole of his shoe had worn away so much that he could no longer put newspaper in the shoe to patch it up. There was nothing even to hold the newspaper in. And my grandfather became an apprentice tailor, like Ashok's father. And my grandfather was apparently a world-class bridge player. So think of this guy who could remember where every card was. Think of the brain of that guy. So right. from a different family with different opportunities, would he have been a brain surgeon? Would he have been an eye surgeon? Who knows? And so I think that element of sharing, of being able to lift other people up, that turns out to be really, I think, the measure of a successful life, that relationships, internal equanimity.
Wow, that was lots to take away from that. The next question is from Himanshu Singhal, and he's referring to the chapter on simplicity, and wants to know if there are, can we distill down certain rules to kind of bring more simplicity to things that we do in life or in work.
Yeah, the idea of simplicity is incredibly powerful. And what struck me, I thought maybe I was going off the deep end in writing that chapter, because I started to find all of these examples of other ways in which simplicity is incredibly powerful. So you see it in investing, but you also see it. So think of something like Joel Greenblatt's line that I mentioned before, where he said, the whole secret of investing is to value a business and buy it for much less. That's it. That's the essence of it. Or Will Danoff, who manages over $200 billion at Fidelity, said to me, it all comes down to this. Stocks follow earnings. So in the long run, if he made a fortune buying things like Starbucks around the IPO, in the long run, if a company grows very well over many years, you're likely to do well, unless you pay a ridiculous price for it. So you have to pay attention to value as well, which is something a lot of investors forgot recently. So simplicity matters in investing, right? Look at Jack Bogle as well, who said to me, it was obvious that indexing was going to beat the average mutual fund because we didn't have the burden of all of the expenses, and so it was just obvious that it was going to win. It had had basic simple mathematics going for it. But what fascinated me is that you could take this idea of simplicity and apply it in all of these other areas of life. So you look at a company like Google, and that little lozenge on your screen, the tiny lozenge, is just like a really simple screen. And this becomes one of the biggest, most successful companies in the world. You look at Apple, and Steve Jobs was clearly influenced by the kind of minimalist aesthetic of Zen Buddhism. And so there's something very simple, very easy to use, very beautiful. But then what's really interesting is you look at simplicity in other areas of life. So you think of spirituality, think of the Old Testament, which has basically 613 commandments. So nobody can remember them. Nobody even knows really what they are. I don't think if you add them all up, you can figure them out. So then I was like, so wait a second. So the 10 commandments, it's like a top 10 list. And so then I start to think, well, so can I remember the 10 commandments? And I got something like 4 of them right. And I think I probably lied about getting 4 of them right. And then I started to think, well, so there was this great sage about 2,000 years ago called Hillel, who was asked, can you sum up the Old Testament while standing on one leg? So he had to do it really quickly. And he says something along the lines of, do unto others what you would have them do to you. You know, treat others the way you want them to treat you. And then he said, all the rest is commentary. Now go and learn. And so you think of the golden rule. It's all about how do you treat other people? Treat people the way you want to be treated. And I thought that's a really fascinating thing, that you can simplify that process of simplifying things down from 613 rules to 10 rules to 1 rule. And so I think if there's a takeaway here, I mean, I kind of felt self-conscious. I'm like, wait a second, I'm going off on this mad digression. Everyone's going to think I'm nuts. But there are very practical takeaways. And so I think one of the things you want to do is find a few principles, both in investing and in life, that are at least approximately true over time. And so there are going to be times, for example, where buying things for less than their worth is not going to work for years. There are going to be times where buying stocks with great earnings in the expectation that prices will follow earnings is not going to work for years because they got overvalued, for example, or nobody wants to buy stocks. Or but you want to find a few principles that work over time on average. And so I think one of them is to buy things cheap, buy things that are undervalued. One of them is to buy good businesses. But also in life, I mean, I have all of these Post-its on my wall here that I've written, and I refer to them the whole time with rules. So one thing here, it says, I can see this. So this is why I'm reading it to you. It says, this is from David Hawkins. It says, be kind to everything and everyone, including oneself, all the time, without exception. Now, I fail on this the whole time, right? I mean, I beat the crap out of myself frequently because I'm a schmuck. Then I'm rude to other people, or I'm bad tempered because I'm hungry or whatever. But at least I know that's a kind of North Star. It's like, if over time, on average, I become kinder, once in a while I'll get taken advantage of, or once in a while I'll be so focused on being kind that I don't pay attention to other things that are really important, like being more self-disciplined or whatever. But on average, over time, if I can learn to be kinder, I think that's probably going to be a good thing. And on average, over time, if I exercise, if I meditate, if I try to compound goodwill, it's probably a good thing. And so I think if you can try to find a few simple principles that truly resonate, that deeply resonate for you, adopt them and really internalize them and go big on them, and then keep coming back to them. And so you want some mechanism, I think, to pound them into your head. So I have something here where I have a framed thing that's written in Hebrew letters that has various words on them that I got someone to write to remind me of certain principles. Or I have something down here that I think I quoted it from the Buddha in the book. It's another post-it that's something like do good, purify the mind, and something else. I can't remember what it is, but it was like 12 words, 10 words, 12 words, you know. So you want to keep those things near you, so you can so you can keep rediscovering your true north. And again, every time you mess up, let go with self-compassion and begin again.
Fantastic, William. William, we have, there are 2 or 3 similar questions. I'll try and combine them into one question. There's one including from Rajneesh. They say that most of the investors that are featured in the book, they made their wealth, or they had their successes in probably what was a different era, say right through the early 50s and until the mid 80s or 90s. But now the way businesses are changing, the business cycles are getting shorter. How easy or difficult it is to apply those principles for the future of investing? Any thoughts?
Yeah, it's a really profoundly important question. And I remember Bill Miller once saying to me, I've interviewed Bill for probably 80, 90 hours over the years. And the first time I wrote about him, I think, was probably back in 2001, when he was in the middle of this streak of beating the market for 15 years. Maybe it was 11 or 12 years into it. An amazing thing. I remember him saying to me, the biggest problem in markets is that things change. They don't stay the same. And so one of the difficulties is that you learn these eternal principles, right? Like value a business and buy it for much less. Stocks follow earnings. And then you're like, yeah, it's mostly true, but also things change. And what about different environments? And when I look at Bill, one of the extraordinary things about him is that he's managed to adapt to different periods. And so, he basically reinvented value investing. So he started to buy tech stocks that outraged people. Howard Marks was telling me recently that he remembered seeing Bill Miller around 2001, I think, and saying to him, I see you buying Amazon. He's like, what the hell are you doing? This doesn't look like value investing. And Bill was like, seems cheap to me. And, Bill told me a couple of years ago that he was the biggest individual shareholder of Amazon, not named Bezos, because he just bought so much over the years and had never sold it. And so that's someone who understood the classical principles of buying dirt cheap stocks the way that Buffett and Ben Graham did, but who also had the adaptability to start saying, well, maybe there are ways of buying things cheap within the tech world, because he started to study at the Santa Fe Institute, for example. He would study complexity, and he could see, well, there are these network effects. And I can see that these businesses like Amazon or Google have these competitive advantages that come from their scale. So it's a really complicated thing. It's like every time you try to tell someone a simple rule, it's like, yeah, but the opposite is also true. It's like you were saying, Saurabh, before, where you said there's Mohnish on the one hand, who's cloning like crazy. And then there's Sir John Templeton in the very next chapter, who's basically saying, nobody influenced me. I was totally a loner. And I think this is one of the exquisite things about investing is that, and about life, is that both things are true. The opposites are usually true. So you have to, you remember that there's some line, some adage that I'll misquote and garble, but about strong convictions lightly held. And so you have to have strong convictions. You have to believe certain things. You have to believe that if I buy things cheap, over time, I'm going to do well. If I buy great businesses that are growing, over time, I'm going to do well. But you also have to have those strong convictions lightly held. And you have to say, yeah, but what if I'm wrong? And so you always have to have the humility to hedge against your own fallibility and against the fact that the future is uncertain and none of us knows. And so one of the things that I cloned from Sir John Templeton is he said to me, as a regular investor, you should probably own 4 or 5 funds, that sort of thing. Like, why should you be arrogant enough to believe that you can pick the one fund, the one investor, the one country, the one asset class? And I've thought about that so many times over the last 20 years, I can't even tell you, where I'm getting carried away. I interview someone and I'm like, God, this is the most brilliant thing. And then I'm like, yeah, but maybe not. And so what Jeff Gundlach, who's often known as the king of bonds, said to me is, you have to ask yourself, what's the consequence if I'm wrong? So just to start with the humility to say, yes, I believe this. I believe these principles work over time. but what if I'm wrong? Let me hedge against myself. So when you believe that Bitcoin is going to 200,000, great. Study it, figure out, build your circle of competence, understand the technology, understand the supply demand picture, understand the counter arguments for why it's a non-productive asset or whatever, be able to articulate the counter arguments just as well as the arguments in favor, and then say, yeah, and what if I'm wrong? And so you're always hedging against your own fallibility and the fact that the future is unknown. And I think that would mean that, yes, you want to invest in India, but you also want to say, yeah, but India is not the whole world. Let me invest elsewhere as well. Yes, you want to invest in stocks, but maybe I should own a little property. Maybe I should own some commodities. Maybe, just hedge against your own fallibility.
Salil, if you don't mind, I'll just come in with a question here. So, one of the fascinating aspects of the book, William, is, you have very diverse personalities in the book. So you have people who've had an elite education. You mentioned Templeton being a Yale student. Warren Buffett obviously famously went to Columbia. So there's a whole bunch of people in the book who studied at all sorts of famous places. And then there are people like Mohnish who went to Claremont University, right? So, basis your interactions with these people over the last 3 decades, is a central driver of success, or is it the individuality of these people that shines through?
I think temperament probably matters more than anything. And what's amazing, I did an interview recently on the Richer, Wiser, Happier podcast with Aswath Damodaran. And Aswath, who's extraordinary, said to me, yeah, I've made all of my classes available for free online. And so you don't need to come to NYU. You don't need to spend, $60,000, $70,000 a year or whatever it costs now to get an MBA at NYU. You can study his valuation techniques for free online. So many resources are available. Yeah. I mean, you can read all of these books. They're all available. What's amazing is that the greatest investors have been so generous in sharing their principles, in sharing their thinking. And so you could just read all of Warren Buffett's shareholder letters over the last 50 years. It's probably a better education than any MBA you could get. You could read all of Charlie's speeches. You could study Poor Charles Almanac. You'd read Howard Marks' book, The Most Important Thing, especially the illuminated edition is very good. You'd read Joel Greenblatt's books. They've been incredibly generous in sharing the principles. So you can figure this stuff out without going to a super fancy college, which is amazing. I mean, Mohnish came from a $20 a month apartment in Mumbai, in the suburbs of Mumbai, and what was then Bombay. He educated himself. That's an amazing thing. But you need the temperament. You look at someone like Nick Sleep, who studied geography and geology. Nick just has an extraordinary temperament, and he educated himself on the principles that mattered most. And so he was saying, for example, everyone else, so many other people on Wall Street are obsessed with what he called wiggle guessing. They're all trying to figure out what does this news today mean? Is the recovery going to look like a V, or is it going to look like a Nike swoosh? And he's like, I don't care. He's like, I'm going to look at a business and I'm going to say, what's the destination for a business like Costco or Amazon or Berkshire Hathaway in 10, 20, 30 years? Is it a good destination? And how is it going to reach that destination? What are the inputs to get it to that destination? Is it treating its customers well? Is it driving down costs? Is it saving its customers money and time? And is it treating its suppliers well? And so that's a very basic, very simple, but very profound question that led him to have an incredibly concentrated portfolio that basically, now that he's retired, basically consists of 3 or 4 stocks. It's Berkshire, Costco, and Amazon, because they're all companies with great destinations. And so he understands the principles of investing, but then he has an extraordinary temperament, this incredible patience to ride these stocks through thick and thin. And then the ability to focus on what really matters, on information. I explained this in the chapter about Nick and his partner, Kay Sakaria, the ability to focus on information that has a long shelf life, So while everyone else is focused on wiggle guessing, on short-term information, on worries about inflation and did my stock do well today, he is just looking at long-term destinations. And that's a temperamental thing, that extreme patience, that common sense to ask these simple questions of, is the destination good, and is the business, is the management doing the things that will get them to that destination? And so I think you just want to go through life thinking more long term, while everyone else is getting caught up in these short-term games, like the dopamine hits of trading incessantly, renting stocks instead of owning them for the long term. And also, these short-term dopamine hits from, checking Twitter constantly, eating the sixth donut, whatever. The more you can focus on the long term, on things, on good long-term destinations and what's going to get you there. I think that gives you a tremendous competitive advantage in a world where so many people are caught up in the short term. And I can say this honestly because I'm so caught up in the short term myself. So I'm a fellow sufferer.
William, one last question. We can't help but ask you, in that sort of mountain of books behind you, and perhaps there's another mountain you're saying which is hidden from us. What are the 2 or 3 best books that you've come across on investors and investing? Because we just need to learn as much as we can from these great people.
Well, I mentioned some investing books, like I think Howard Marks' Illuminated edition of The Most Important Thing is a terrific book. I think Joel Greenblatt's little book that beats the market is really good. But I would also encourage you to read. There's a very long section in the back of the book called Notes on Additional Sources and Resources, where I slip in a lot of recommendations of books that these great investors read that had an impact on them in life. And so think of something like Power versus Force by David Hawkins, which had a transformative impact on Mohnish. And we talk about this a lot, both in chapter 1, but also in the recent interview that I did with Mohnish on the Richer, Wiser, Happier podcast, because it totally and utterly changed his life. Because Mohnish decided, I'm just going to be truthful. And so that turns out to be a habit that's compounded over decades in an extraordinary way. And so, Mohnish was messaging me last week, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm going out on Charlie's catamaran today." Why would Charlie Munger want to adopt Mohnish as a really close friend? It's because he's a guy with integrity, and so that one habit, Mohnish decided at a certain point, I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to pay bribes, even if there's something that's going to make life much easier for Dakshina. Just not going to do it. And so I'm not going to be dishonest. And so when you interview Mohnish, it's amazing the things that he'll tell you. I read about this in the book. At one point, I said to him, I sort of as an experiment in truthfulness, I wrote to him and I'm like, "What's your net worth now?" And he writes back, I think at the time, he was like, "It's $153 million, but that doesn't include this or whatever." And it was just kind of amazing to see someone who's just decided, I'm not going to lie, I'm going to operate with integrity. And I remember once, Mohnish very kindly bought a bunch of copies of my book to give as gifts when it first came out. And I said to him, I had this email exchange, and I said, if you buy them through this particular seller, it will be cheaper for you and it will benefit me less. And I explained how it worked and why my publicist was trying to get him to buy them in a particular way that would hurt him and benefit me. And so I explained this totally openly, how it didn't serve his best interest, the advice that he was getting. And Mohnish turns around and immediately does it the way that hurts him and benefits me. And it was just a really interesting experiment where I was like, I'm going to be radically truthful with Mohnish. I'm not going to lie to him and manipulate him. And Mohnish then is like, I'm going to behave decently and honorably in a way that's going to hurt me, but is going to help him. And so it's just really interesting to see when you see people actually applying these approaches, when you realize that it's not just words, you actually see someone like Mohnish behaving that way consistently. So I think Power versus Force has been a really seminal book. And another book that I mentioned that I end the book with, in a sense, that book on Notes and Additional Resources, is from a guy called James Allen, who was a hero to Arnold Vandenberg. And James Allen was very remarkable. I was looking at it this morning. I have this big stack here. This is a collection of James Allen's books, and it's called Mind is the Master, the Complete James Allen Treasury. It includes a book called From Poverty to Power, and a book called As a Man Thinketh. And the thing that's really important that had a transformative impact on Arnold, who was a Holocaust survivor, is that it's all about changing the internal game, the internal landscape of your life. So what James Allen said is, the thing that's ultimately going to determine whether you have a successful and happy life is your inner state. And so what Arnold took from this, Arnold's an incredibly admirable person who I end the book with. What Arnold took from this is, I'm going to work on myself. I'm going to improve my own character. I'm going to become more honest, more decent, more sharing, kinder, more disciplined, more driven. And so instead of blaming his external circumstances, which were terrible, I mean, he barely made it through. He spent the Holocaust in hiding because he was a Jewish kid born in Amsterdam in 1939 during World War II. So he had a terrible childhood. And people, his teachers thought he had brain damage because he'd been malnourished as a child growing up in an orphanage during the Holocaust. And so what changed Arnold's life was saying, no, I'm responsible for the outcome in my own life, and I'm going to work on myself, my inner life. And as I change my own belief system and my own behavior, my external circumstances will reflect that. And that's an incredibly important realization, that your thoughts, your equanimity, your behavior when nobody's looking, really matter. And so I think James Allen figured out a lot of this stuff, but I think it runs through all of these great spiritual teachers, whether you're reading about the great Buddhists, or you're reading Ramana Maharshi, or the Old Testament. They all figured out it's an inner game. And so there's something, I was looking at James Allen this morning, and he quotes that line, I think from probably the New Testament, about the kingdom of heaven is within. And he's like, you've really got to think about that. And so you need to understand it's all about the inner game. You have to, and what I think it means is that you have to take seriously how you're going to work on yourself. That's really going to determine whether your life is happy and successful. And so externally, you might have all the money, all of the fame, all of that, but you have to work on yourself internally, whether it's to have more equanimity or just to be more proud of who you are. And I mess up on this the whole time. So I'm not in any way saying this in a sanctimonious, self-righteous way. I'm saying this as someone who screws up constantly. But at least by studying things like James Allen and by studying people like Arnold Vandenberg, I at least know what the game is. I know that it's not enough just to rack up credentials or degrees or money. It's just not enough. There's got to be this focus on the inner landscape, on working on yourself individually. And when I look at Arnold, someone in his 80s, the reason why I end the book with him is I look at him and I think, what an admirable human being. Let me try to become more like that.
Thank you very much, William Green. Thank you for nudging all of us to improve our inner game, our inner scorecard. Thank you for writing the book and for sharing insights with us over the past hour. We look forward to your next book. And thanks to everybody else who's joined in. Thank you, Salil. Thanks, Pooja. Good evening, folks, and have a great evening. Bye for now.
Thank you.
It was a great talk.
Thanks so much.
Bye.